And I certainly don't get the sense of the kind of overheated rhetoric and vehement opposition that you sometimes would get back in the early days from industry. Overall, and certainly business is part of it, but even with the public and the media, I think there's a better understanding of what the boards do.
Welcome to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. My guest in this episode is Graham White, who has spent his career studying co-management and attended so many co-management board meetings over the decades. He's a highly productive scholar, and he comes at co-management from a political science lens. I really like how he highlights that the North has been and continues to be one of the most fascinating parts of Canada from a governance perspective in recent times, and I'm sure there are going to be many more changes to come. Graham is retired now from the University of Toronto, and he has a wealth of information to share, and I'm really happy he took this time to share. I hope you enjoy. Graham, it's really great to have you on the Co-Management Commons podcast. It's a real pleasure. I think you're one of the very first authors I can remember seeing out there in the literature when I started typing in co-management. I know you've been very productive over a long career and have probably seen it all in the co-management sector. So I'm really excited that you took the time to come on with us today.
Well, thanks for the invitation. As you know, with most academics, we're always real happy to pontificate.
Fair enough. Well, before we get right into that, then why don't you tell me more about who you are? Like, because I know it's really interesting to learn so much more about the individuals behind the first author on these papers, but where are you from?
Well, those are two rather different questions, but I'll do both.
Yeah, yeah.
So, the bad news, as far as many people in this country will be concerned with, is that I've lived in Toronto, other than a few years at graduate school, since I was 4 years old. The good news is that in my heart, I remain a Cape Bretoner because I was born in Cape Breton and I still actually own land there. Um, Sadly, my 75th birthday passed recently, meaning the prospects of a Senate appointment are just, they're gone. It's not going to happen. Despite the all the hints I dropped over the years, not going to happen. Anyway, I was always interested in school kind of stuff. But when I was finishing graduate school, there were no academic jobs, and so for reasons you needn't be concerned about, I ended up working in the clerk's office, a nonpartisan clerk's office at the legislature for 6 years. And then after that, there were some jobs. I got a job at the University of Toronto. And the legislature job is important because that's how I got into doing northern things. I had, as you know, in the academic world, it's not just about ivory towers and thinking great thoughts. You got to be productive. You got to churn out books and articles and whatnot. I had just finished the book that I thought, and it turned out to be the case, that was going to get me tenure. So, okay, that's great. What do I do now? So I was looking around for a new project and I had some ideas, but wasn't really sure. And actually, if the logs of the CBC radio for 1987 were available, I could tell you to the minute when my northern career began. Because at that point, my wife and I had the CBC News set to come on the clock radio, 7 o'clock in the morning. And there was a report from a guy named Raj Alawalia, who at that point was I actually knew him later in Toronto, but at that point he was a reporter from Iqaluit, and he was talking about this strange territorial election that was going on with no political parties. But then he explained a little bit about it. And I knew about that because I actually knew some people from the NWT assembly, and I knew that. But then he ended off the report by saying, and many people think this will be the last territorial election without political parties. And all of a sudden the lights went on. And I thought, okay, until I figure out what I really want to do, why don't I do this nice little quick and dirty? I'll go to Yellowknife because I'd always wanted it, like everyone else. I always wanted to go to the north. I'll go to Yellowknife. I'll do a little survey and an analysis of the place now without political parties, and then come back in a while when the political parties are there. It'd be a really nice natural experiment. Okay, two things happened that kind of got in the way of that plan. I had to get a small grant from the university to pay for this. And actually, as I was doing the literature review for this grant application, I was looking around for other British parliamentary systems that had no parties, but also had a strong Indigenous component to them. And there actually were some in the South Seas. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm reading and looking into Fiji in order to get money to go to Yellowknife in February. What is wrong with this picture? But hey, I went. And it turned out that they still don't have parties, but it turned out that as soon as I got off the plane, I thought this is the most interesting political place I've ever seen. Not just because of the so-called consensus government, that continues to fascinate me, but with all the interlay of the indigenous self-government movements and all kinds of stuff happening. And nobody else, no, that's not fair. There were a small number of people doing some of that, but as someone who was interested in government institutions, pretty much nobody was doing that kind of thing. The field was open to me. People were incredibly welcoming and helpful. And I just thought, this is it. So I continued doing that essentially till I retired, and actually a little beyond that as well.
So you were really there at the very ground floor of a lot of those agreements getting set up. Then, if you're going back to the NWT ones for sure. And
Oh yeah, my first trip there was in the fall of 1988, and
okay.
the Nunavut negotiations were ongoing, and I actually happened to be there when the announcement was made. It wasn't the signing, but the announcement was made that in fact they pretty much come to agreement on everything, and that was a pretty nifty thing. And then afterwards, following the creation of Nunavut, I mean, for a guy who grooves on structures and processes of government, it doesn't get any better than these folks literally creating a new government.
It is kind of a once in a career opportunity, I guess, really, when you think about it, because there's so many new things and being at the forefront of that. I guess just trying to zero in a little bit with all of those institutions that started to be evolving. How did you start to gravitate specifically to the co-management institutions that formed under those land claim
Ah, yes.
agreements?
Yes, co-management. Well, I'd like to tell you that from the time I was 17 years old, I had a burning ambition to study and understand co-management, but you wouldn't buy that for a minute because it ain't true. What happened was, I mean, I was vaguely aware that and this was in the NWT and a little bit in Yukon because Nunavut did not exist at this point, nor did Nunatsiavut. So I was aware of them, but didn't know much about them, and frankly wasn't terribly interested. So maybe about 10 years into my work in the North, the grant that I had at the time was about to run out. And you simply cannot, as a guy based in Toronto, you just cannot continue. You have to be there. You can't do it by remote control. So I needed a new grant, and I was, it's always a bit dicey looking for grants. And a colleague of mine, I guess I must have been whining about this. A colleague of mine said, "Well, there's this new program the federal government has started through SHIRK about federalism." And I said, "No, I didn't know that." And so what had happened was, as you will remember, this country had a near-death experience in 1995 with the Quebec referendum. And afterwards, among other things, the Privy Council office decided they needed to have some new ideas about federalism. And they looked around and they realized, which was entirely the case, that the Canadian political science community had moved off from federalism. Almost nobody was doing it. So, understanding the academic community very well and knowing that the best way, if you want to get academics interested, is to dangle some money in front of them, they created this fairly substantial grant program. And so my colleague said, you should apply for that. No, I don't do federalism. And he said, well, you're creative. Think of something. So I did think about it, and I went back and thought, well, those co-management boards, I don't really understand them, but if I really do, if I understand what they're mostly about, yeah, they are kind of federal, and federalism is about power sharing. And that's what co-management is about. So I wrote up this application. And as you were probably aware, the very best time to apply to a grant program is in its first year. And so I got the grant. And then I thought, I got to do this. Do I really want to do this co-management board stuff? But I had to. But again, once I got into it in just the smallest amount, I realized this is great stuff. It raises all kinds of interesting questions. It's intellectually, but it's also really important. It's got huge potential importance for affecting the relationship between the Indigenous people and the non-Indigenous people and the governments of this country. So after that initial, what am I going to do? I really took to it and attended quite a number of board meetings in Nunavut, particularly the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, Yukon, the Fish and Wildlife Management Board, and I didn't attend board meetings of the environmental boards in NWG because they're not open to the public, but I did attend quite a number of their hearings. So that's what ended up the basis of my research and the various publications.
I'm just trying to think about all of the context of going to all of those meetings and getting up and there and like maybe you could share some stories of what the co-management board meetings looked like in those early days. Because one of the things that the literature's captured a little bit is this whole idea of the fact that co-management is as much about managing relationships and people and so on. And I'm always curious to hear what people thought they had negotiated and how they made sense of it then in those early meetings and how they kind of got going with the actual business of co-management and like what were some of your observations from those earlier periods?
Yeah, well, actually, I in effect really started this project in 1989 or 90. And by that point, although Nunavut only came into existence in 99, the boards had been up and running for several years. They effectively started once the claim was settled in 93. So the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board had been working away for several years, and the same thing was true of the one in Yukon following the Yukon umbrella agreement. So it wasn't as if I wasn't there at the very beginning. It was fairly early, but they had already established both of them. And I also spent some time in Nuvik with the Wildlife Management Advisory Committee, NWT, because there's the two of them. And one of the things that really struck me, especially going in, I was wondering, okay, so you have these people who are appointed or recommended by the public governments, by the territorial government, and by the indigenous organizations. And, are we going to see people going at it like this and disagreeing and so on? And I was just blown away, I have to say, by how well they understood one another. They didn't always agree, but in many instances, if I didn't know who had been appointed or recommended by which organization, uh, I couldn't have told you from the discussion that unfolded. And again, that's not to say that everybody agreed, but in particular, instances where there were bureaucrats serving as board members, and not just there were some former bureaucrats, but there were also bureaucrats whose their day job was to deal with the issues before these boards. And so you'd think there'd be this conflict, and the bureaucrats, whether they liked it or not, following the government line and so on. And there was very little of that. Certainly you'd have them say the policy in the department is such and so, and here's how it works. And you can sort of tell sometimes that they would have liked to have said, I think it's stupid, but that's how it works. But overall, I was just really taken by how seriously everyone took each other's, and they all knew part of it, of course. It's a very human thing, as we've talked about. They knew each other quite well. They'd often spent a lot of time in boardrooms and planes and so on, and out on the land. There would be a fair number of instances where the the bureaucrats or the people appointed by the various public governments and so on would have gone out with the indigenous hunters for, it wasn't part of the formal board stuff, but they'd all been around. I guess that's the other thing. They'd all been around, particularly in the wildlife area. They'd all been around a long time, and most of them probably had known each other long before they even got appointed to the boards. So that was really a revelation to me that, I was expecting people to do their best and so on, but be fairly constrained by what they felt they had to do for their organization. And I'm sure that was in the back of people's heads, and it certainly affected perspectives that they brought. But I was, it sounds kind of hokey and corny, but I was really impressed with how seriously they all took the importance of understanding one another and reaching some kind of consensual outcome.
I remember talking to lots of different board members now over the years, and one of the things, I guess, a light bulb moment I had at some point was the fact that the dialogues themselves become so influential in how people end up seeing things in the end, where obviously we bring all kinds of other things to the table when we have our discussions, whether it's our life histories and educations and work experiences and all these sort of things. But the dialogue is so important. And when you talk about power sharing, I was interested to talk to you today also about some of the observations you've made over the years about Indigenous influence on the boards and the co-management board's influence overall. And just wondering how you saw that play out over the years.
Sure. Well, let me plug the book.
Okay, definitely.
But actually, the main reason, other than plugging the book, for doing this is I wanted to call the book Indigenous Empowerment Through Co-Management question mark. But publishers aren't real big on question marks and titles, so they said, no, we don't want to do that, that was fine. But the reason I wanted to do that was it is an open question, and it wasn't it. I had to think a fair bit about what the conclusion was. And as you say, I mean, that was one of the main reasons I was interested in all this stuff, because the whole purpose of the exercise and the expectation, particularly on the Indigenous side, when the claims were being negotiated and setting up and establishing these boards, was to have influence. They weren't there for window dressing. They wanted stuff to happen. So in the end, I did conclude, and probably it's appropriate not to have the question mark, I did conclude that overall, yes, the boards have provided quite significant, palpable influence to Indigenous people. Now, there's a lot of qualifications here. For starters, the bar was set really low because prior to the claims coming in, Indigenous influence was essentially non-existent. That for better or worse, the folks at Diane, and I live in the past, it's always going to be Diane for me. The
Right.
folks at Diane made the decisions, and some of them might consult with the local hunters, and some of them might not, but there's certainly no institutional framework, and overall there was very little indigenous influence. Okay, so in a sense it could hardly be worse. I mean, that's a really kind of backwards way of looking at it, but I think it's much more than that. It's also important to keep in mind that we're talking about influence. I'm title is empowerment. That's a jazzier word for a title, but we're talking about influence here, not power, because again, there are relatively few. There are some, but there are relatively few things that boards can decide on their own and make it happen. There's a limited number of them. By and large, the vast number of things, they make recommendations to public governments and occasionally to Indigenous organizations, but essentially to the public governments. So the power mainly still resides with the public governments, but there is very significant active involvement by Indigenous people. I mean, they are board members, and for the most, in many boards, they're an absolute majority. And one of the things I think it's certainly worth noting is that the perhaps contrary to some people's expectations, that the public governments are not at all shy about appointing Indigenous people to the boards. And I think that's great. That tells you, I think, a fair bit. So the board members are there getting their say in public, but also communities that the legal framework of each and every board is somewhat different, which I guess is a really good thing for the lawyers who were involved. But all of them, to some degree, and often a very significant degree, require community participation and provide for it, sometimes even with funds for community representatives or HTO people to come to board meetings, to meet with the board and explain their position and so on, or even do some research and what have you. So it's not just that there are the Indigenous board members there participating in making these recommendations, but also the communities have very significant input. And the boards have become, and they were this from the very beginning. I mean, there are some teething problems, I guess, but as far as I could, by the time I started watching, let's put it that way, by the time I started watching, boards had become pretty good at including and understanding the perspectives of the Indigenous people, but doing so through very well thought out, very well written, persuasive reports. So making it no guarantees the government would always agree, but for the most part, governments did go along with recommendations that the boards made. And the point here is that the boards acted in a way that ensured they were taken seriously by the public government. So you add that all up, and it is fair to say certainly that there are critics of the boards, some Indigenous saying we didn't get nearly as much as we should have, to which others in the system, and I mean it. I felt comfortable making the overall call that yes, there was Indigenous empowerment or influence in this, because so many of the Indigenous board members or Indigenous people in Indigenous organizations told me that. There were some who said, no, we should have had a lot more in the claim, but that was a minority. And then there are some academics who argue, and with some reason, that yes, there are things that Indigenous people have accomplished and can accomplish through these boards, but they're sucked into the Western bureaucratic model and losing their way of doing things and so on. And yeah, there's something to be said for that. But I guess I'm a realist. And I think, sure, you can always do better, but let's make stuff happen now, not, sit around for another 25 years trying to dream up the ideal system, which probably doesn't exist anyway, and understand that yes, it can always be better, and yes, work away at getting it better, but appreciate what you've got now, which is overall a pretty effective system for getting Indigenous perspectives and preferences into the policymaking process.
You're really speaking to me there because I know on a day to day basis when you come to work in a co management setting, none of us got the privilege of burning the system down on a Monday or whatever. So it makes sense to go to work and try to make these things work to the best of their ability for the people that sign those claims. So you got to find motivation in making what we got work. And like you said, everything's not going to be perfect, but there's certainly ways to be creative, and you can do a good job in this field if you put your mind to it. And I'm thinking like you're going back to the late 80s, so over that 30-year time period, then staying connected to co-management boards over that whole time. Would you say there's any general observations you've noticed, maybe in terms of change or maturity or the way things happen to be today? Any sort of broad
Yeah,
observations?
I think there's a few things come to mind. Uh, First and foremost, perhaps, the boards have become entrenched and respected. They've been around a long time. People are becoming familiar with them. And as I thought about this, one thing that hadn't occurred to me was if you go back into the early days, and this is more so with the environmental boards than the wildlife boards, but when you go back to the early days, it was very common for industry representatives either appearing before the board or talking to the media, going ballistic about how awful it all was, and we can't, we have to pull out, we can't handle this regulatory system, it's awful and it's killing our business and so on. You don't get much of that anymore. That the business and industry may not like everything that's going on, but they've learned to live with it. It's not going away. They've learned to live with it, and there's no. I don't want to pretend that I'm still doing active research in this, so I'm somewhat out of the loop, but I do try to pay attention, and I certainly don't get the sense of the kind of overheated rhetoric and vehement opposition that you sometimes would get back in the early days from industry. Overall, and certainly business is part of it, but even with the public and the media, I think there's a better understanding of what the boards do. Now, that has to be qualified by saying, as I'm sure you encounter on a fairly regular basis, there's still a lot of misunderstanding about what these strange beings are. A lot of people think they're just sort of garden variety government departments or something and don't understand that they are co-management and where the board members come from and so on. But overall, I think there's better understanding. It's also fair to say, and you'd have to chart individual boards here, but there's certainly been ebbs and flows. I mean, some boards have gone through tough times. There have been periods where usually it's the feds who are at fault. There have been periods where boards couldn't make quorum because they didn't have enough members because appointments hadn't been made. There were times when the administration or the quality of the board members wasn't very good. But there have also been times, as I say, ebbs and flows. You could look at a particular board and say, geez, those few years, they had some pretty tough times, but they pulled their socks up and they got better. Or this board is, used to be really good and it's, I don't know, it's kind of lost its edge and whatnot. And part of the reason for that, and I think this is a really significant point about the boards, and it goes to sort of the larger where is it all now? Every board that I can think of, the number of people, the number of key people is very small. You have at most two or three top administrators, and some of the smaller boards, maybe just one. executive director, the chair of the board, and maybe co-chairs or a couple of other people. You're talking about a very small number of people. And if they leave or lose interest or bad appointments are made, it doesn't take much for a board to lose its edge, descend into not very effective ways of going about things and so on, because there's so few, it's so dependent on a very small number of people. And that's never going to change. The boards are never going to have huge staffs and so on. So there's always a bit of precariousness to the boards. And I guess the good news is that overall, the times when individual boards weren't functioning very well are relatively small. And I'd have to know more about them than I actually do. But my sense is that there are, it's not as if there are boards that once upon a time were really great, fell apart, and have never gotten their act together again. As I say, there's ebbs and flows. And I think that's inevitable given the dependence on the very small number of people involved. The other quite different issue is that governments respond to them in different ways. That can change too. And in the book, I talk about a couple of instances. Now, this was mostly to do with environmental boards in the NWT in Yukon, where the Harper government tried to make some very fundamental changes to the board setup that that I think it's fair to say they genuinely thought would make for improvements, but the vast majority of the Indigenous organizations were adamant that this was not the way to go, that it was abrogating the spirit, if not the letter, of the claims and so on. Now, in the end, the stuff didn't happen because the Conservatives lost power to the Liberals before they could actually make this stuff happen. The larger point is that, yes, there are these claims that are constitutionally protected. They're part of the Constitution of Canada in a direct way. And yet, the attitude of the public governments, especially the federal government, because that's where most of the money comes from, one way or another. But even the most of the legislation that establishes these boards is federal legislation, or less so than it used to be, but it's still there. So the larger point here is that how governments react to, respond to, orient themselves towards the boards, that's not always a given. That can change, and it has changed. So again, there's a certain precariousness there. And I guess the final thing I'd say is that it's been a bit of a tough slog, and it's still got a ways to go. But if you look at the long arc, in my mind, there's no question that all round there's much greater acceptance of traditional knowledge than there had been when the claims were assigned. That from the early days, you might get some lip service from federal bureaucrats or scientists. Not all of them. It's unfair to tar everybody with that brush, but there was certainly, let's say, a lack of wide acceptance, and I think that's changed perceptibly. Not to say that all federal bureaucrats appreciate and understand TK, and that there's always going to be different perspectives on what it means and how to use it in a board setting. But overall, I think the tendency is very clear for greater acceptance and use of traditional knowledge.
That's super interesting, and I'd love to hear more of the second point you brought up about the time when, I guess, a previous government was contemplating making changes to the boards. I don't have any knowledge of that, and curious to hear what some of the ideas were at the time by government and how they were proposing to change the co-management board system. If you want to shed more light on that, that'd be super interesting.
Sure. It almost, if I thought hard enough about it and knew more about it, I might be able to come with some instances from the wildlife side, but it's the ones I'm thinking about, and the ones I talk about in the book are entirely on the environmental regulation side. And it was particularly the case in the NWT. And the argument was, and there was something, there were studies done. The argument was that there were too many boards, the system was too fragmented, and it wasn't full, and it was slow, the usual sorts of things. And the basic proposal was so the environmental boards in the NWT, other than in the Inuvialuit region, because their claim sets up a different process and boards, are all covered by the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, and which is a federal law. And the proposal, which went a long way down the road by the Harper government, was to consolidate these boards and bring them, have a more of a one window approach that would be much more centralized. And in particular, in the NWT, there are a number of regional boards that feed into the basic land and water board. Not so on. It's fairly complicated. There is one, the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board, that does reviews for the entire region. Again, except for the Inuvialuit region. But on the land and water board side, there are several boards. There is a big board that deals with territory-wide issues or transborder issues, but there's several regional boards, and they were the main object of the proposed reforms. And there were hearings about this, there were all kinds of meetings, and the overwhelming response from the Indigenous organizations in the NWT was that this would make for a much worse system. It would cost jobs. It would cost the region's influence because they wouldn't be involved nearly as much. The communities wouldn't have as much involvement or influence and so on. And quite simply that it went directly against what they understood they had signed on for when they agreed to the claim. Frankly, it's pretty clear that if the 2015 election hadn't come along and brought the Liberals to power, the Liberals having promised that if they were elected, they would not just what they did. If that election hadn't happened and the government hadn't changed, there would have been a very major overhaul of the environmental regulation boards in the NWT. And there's also a similar thing going on in the Yukon, different sorts of things. And truth to tell, I don't remember the details of that one as well. But the larger point is that now there were legal cases brought forward. And in fact, one of the Clichan brought a case to hold up the process of going forward with this. And the initial judge's decision, as I recall, was to say, didn't agree with them, but said, this is too important for a quick snap judgment. It really does need to be sorted out with proper argument and so on. So it was put on hold. Now, if the Liberals hadn't won, and if that court case had proceeded, I have no idea what would have happened. But strong likelihood is that most of what the federal government wanted at the time would have happened. Now, I think it's fair to say that while I perfectly understand why the Indigenous organizations were upset, I don't think it would have been as catastrophically awful as they said it would be. It would have been a big change, and it was not to their liking. And there's certainly an argument to be made that it's their land, it's their resources, and they shouldn't have a major change imposed on them against their will. So, to the best of my recollection, it's been a while.
That was really great. And the court case that you mentioned, so that didn't actually transpire. That's not on the books
Well,
anywhere.
there was an initial judgment, as I recall, that just said, yes, this is really important and it needs to be worked. There needs to be a proper adjudication of it. Because I think what the initial application had been was just a request to put the process on hold.
Okay, yeah, I'm curious. I might look that up and have a read of it. I'm sure it's always interesting to see how the judges make sense of things in the case law and stuff. And
Well,
the
it's in
second
the book. If you
is
want to, I do refer to it in the book.
oh, okay, all right. Which chapter is that? I'll have a quick. I'll look at that after, or we can follow up
Yeah, no,
after.
no, I can find it
Uh,
quite quickly. No
okay.
problem.
Well, while you're
No.
searching through that, I'll just let people know. I will put the book and the link to it in the show notes and stuff so people can check that out. And anyone seriously interested in co-management should have a copy. And I'm happy to say we got multiple copies here at our office. So it's really great. And we shared them with our board members because there's always so much to learn from what's happening with these other areas. And the third point you made as well about traditional knowledge is certainly clear. I think there's a lot more seriousness put behind it than it sounds like it was 30 years ago for sure. And I'm just wondering, you referred a few times to there being some strong disagreements in the early days, not all the time, but I'm just wondering, was there any kind of particular issue or set of issues that you could recall that were at the heart of maybe some of them? Was there a common theme there, or were they more kind of issue specific, or it's hard to say?
Yeah, I think it was, as you were saying, I think it was kind of a generalized skepticism.
Right.
But to be fair, there were some instances that I can think of where the bureau, and again, I'm thinking mostly in the wildlife area now, where the bureaucrats and the scientists came to realize that maybe there is something here. And the one that's there's one that sticks out in my mind, um, and it has to do with the bowhead whales in the Atlantic, North Atlantic. And for a long time, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a provision in the Nunavut claim for limited harvest of very limited harvest of bowheads. And DFO was not enthused about this. And because in their understanding and their studies, uh, I don't have the numbers exactly right, but their view was that there were fewer than I think 300 bowhead surviving in the North Atlantic, and they have a long gestation period and so on. So even taking a few every year could be quite detrimental because there were fewer than 300. For a long time, the Inuit said that's crazy. There's way more than that. And a subsequent study revealed that, and again, I don't remember the numbers. I think the numbers that appeared were uh, well over 1,000. I mean, it wasn't just a little bit more; it was orders of magnitude more. And this wasn't a study from the Inuit. This was a standard peer reviewed study that the folks in DFO essentially said, "Oh, yeah, I guess that's right."
Sounds like the
Anyway,
Franklin
but
expedition.
the point was that Inuit traditional knowledge had been saying for a long time, no, there's a lot more than the number DFO says. And DFO said, no, no, we got the studies, we've done all this and so on. But in the end, it turned out they were right. And I think that had a fairly significant effect on the degree to which some of the federal scientists treat how they would treat traditional knowledge from the Inuit, and I'm sure more widely as well.
That's a really great example. And I wonder, I guess the way I phrased that last question maybe was what were some of the disagreements, but I guess over that 30-year period, is there any particular success story or co-management champion that you observed over that period or something that would be neat to highlight? There could be learning in it. I'm sure there's maybe lots of examples, but is there one that really sticks out to you? You must have met a lot of interesting and passionate people over that period of time.
Yeah, I think the way I'd respond to that is that the initial expectation of the answer to that might be, well, that, X at such board was fabulous. There were lots of really good people. X at such and so board was terrific and did wonderful things and so on. But I guess I'd be more inclined to say, you know, it was Joe Inuk, the guy from, you know, small community Y, who didn't have a whole lot of formal education, but knew the land like nobody's business, and in his own quiet way, talked about what needed to be done and what could be done and so on. And there were lots of guys like that. And I don't want to exclude the bureaucrats as well. They were, and some of the scientists. It was or to say ordinary people sounds a little demeaning. I don't mean it that way. Not flashy. I guess what I'm trying to say is not flashy, and not necessarily the people who would appear in the media stories about something. It was the day-to-day guys who would come out, and that's one of the issues here that I haven't looked recently, but for the vast sweep of this, it's almost all guys. There's very few women been involved, but it would be these guys who had a genuine commitment to making the process work, but also knew the land, knew the resources and the animals really well, and in a non-flashy kind of way made it all happen.
That's a perfect way to encapsulate, I feel. There's not just one individual, but it's kind of the unsung heroes of co-management that probably every one of the boards have had multiple of them over
Yes.
the last several decades. And no, I really like to think about it that way too. Thank you for articulating it that way. What do you sort of see as the future of co-management now in the current political science environment? Where do you think we're headed?
I think it's kind of steady state now that in an ideal world, one could expand the notion and the approaches of co-management all across the country and so on. But I think the reality is that unless you have the oomph of a comprehensive land claim, constitutionally protected, you just will not have the influence and the clout that you need for successful co-management. And it'd be great, if they were set up all over the place. But and there are co-management, not that I know more than a tiny bit about them. But the very strong sense I have is that unless there is the legal background, legal support that the claim provides, which part of which is funding, but it involves other things as well. It's unlikely you're going to make the kind of advances to expand co-management that would be a good thing, but I don't think that's going to happen. As I say, the system has become respected and well known. It remains a bit precarious given the small number of key people involved and government attitude. One thing that where there's, in my view, very significant room for improvement is the, to this day, very small number of Indigenous people in senior management positions at at co-management boards. There are certainly some in various different roles, but in terms of executive directors and heads of finance, or whatever the top two or three head of research, top two or three positions in a board would be, there's very few who are Indigenous. And that's a common story across lots of institutions, but particularly given the nature of co-management boards, it strikes me as an area where really there's a need for change.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point you bring up too. And I think it is getting better, but I also think there's room to support what you said in that there's people in our communities that have skill sets that can bring a lot to these boards, and they might not necessarily come to interviews with these flashy CVs and things like you described there earlier. But when it comes to being out on the land and knowing what's happening in a community and with a species and being able to do a lot of these things safely, there's a lot of expertise there. And I know with our own organization that I work with, we've started to hire some people like that that have exceptional land-based skills, and it's kind of like a light bulb moment. Like we should have had these people on staff from day one, as a and because you're never going to have the full complement of skills in a small institution for everything that we're often trying to do. So if you have someone with great land skills, well, maybe then you go and find the academic that has a statistical background or a biologist that knows something about something else. Like you're always sort of fitting the puzzle together anyway with all the different disciplines that come into play. And that local expertise is one that can be prioritized, and those people can be hired first out of the gate, right? So it's been nice to see some really good successes in that regard. And like you said, a much more awareness now of how Indigenous people can be involved in all aspects of the research process, right from helping define the research questions to being involved with data and analysis and communications. There's certainly been a big change in the research environment as well in
Yes.
that regard. And I should congratulate you as well on your latest book. We are in charge here now that captures all of the information on the Nazi assembly and the way the Labrador Inuit Land Claim Agreement has unfolded. Is another great contribution to capture what's different about self-government in this region. So I'll also share that information in the show notes for people who want to
Thank you.
learn more about this situation on the East Coast in the Nazi. And yeah, I guess with that, some of the other things that I'm wondering about now, well, what's next for you? Like you mentioned Senate is not an option, but do you have another research project that you're working on?
Well, I'm not sure that was a good idea to ask that question. However, I began the board project in about 1990, I think it was. Okay, so
Okay.
it took a long time for this book to come out. What I'm working on now, I started 10 years earlier. I
Okay.
started a big project, nothing to do with the North, on provincial cabinets, how
Hmm.
provincial cabinets actually work, not just the organization charts, but the personal dynamics and changes and all that other kind of stuff. And I worked on it off and on for a long time. I worked on it very hard for a few years in the early 90s. And then I got bitten by the northern bug, and that kind of pulled me away. Never lost interest in it. And once I finished the Nunatsiavut assembly book, thought, okay, I'm going to go back because I had tons and tons of really good material here. I'm going to go back and bring it up to date because the I had interviews and lots of material and documents and all that good stuff up to about 2000, 2001 or 2. Okay, I'll bring it up to date. Well, it took maybe a couple of hours thinking about this to realize that's just not going to happen. I don't have the wherewithal, I don't have the money to go to the provincial capitals and all that kind of stuff and whatnot. So what I am doing is writing up what I do have, which covers a period from about 1970 to roughly 2000, depending on the good news. Well, I was looking for provinces. The good news was that in each of the provinces I was looking at, there was an election and a change of government around 2000. So that made a nice, terminal point for it. So I've actually been working on that fairly diligently. Still have many months to go. There's no more research to be done other than the odd fact checking and so on. But there's a lot. I have probably about 250 interviews that I did over the course of this project and documents and all kinds of other stuff. So it's probably the better part of a year before that will be finished. And that, I think, will be my last academic project.
Well, I'll just say, Graham, thank you for coming on to the podcast, but also thank you for all of the research and publications that you shared about the North. I know they're widely read and widely cited, and that documentation of what's happening right across the country is valuable for when new practitioners like me and others start these jobs to be able to have context and understanding of what our own history is really when you are embedded in one of these obscure organizations that people are still trying to understand what we're all about. So thank you for all of that.
Well, thank you. And it's good to know that people find it useful and interesting and so on. But the reality is, the main reason I did it because I like doing this kind of stuff. I mean, you're an academic. You do this because you find it enjoyable. I mean, you try to do it in a way that will be useful to people, but primarily you do it because that's what you want to do.
Yeah, so I'm taking away, and you had a lot of fun doing it.
I did.
Yeah, awesome. All right, you take care.
Thanks, Jamie. You too.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jamie Snook, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Co-Management Commons Show. Honoring the spirit and intent of agreements with Indigenous peoples is an important form of reconciliation and social justice, and educating ourselves about opportunities with co-management is time well spent. This conversation continues, so please like, share, subscribe, and visit www.comanagement.ca. Join me again next time for another interesting discussion about the co-management of fish and wildlife in Canada and around the world.